So welcome everyone. Thanks for being either here with us at the Green Office or online at the launch of the technical report for a data set on the partnerships for sustainable development goals. My name is Montserrat, and together with Cornelia, we are PhDs in this project, and we will be moderating this event. We only have 1 hour, but we're hoping to fill it with an interesting discussion and presentation for everyone. And with that, I don't want to take much time, but I will introduce our speakers today. We have Karin joining us online. Karin Bäckstrand is based at the Political Science Department of the Stockholm University and is the PI of the Transformative Partnerships 2030 project. Then we have Oscar here with us. Oscar Widerberg is with us at IVM here at the FU, and it's the co-lead of the Transformative Partnerships 2030 project. He was, as part of this project, leading work package 1 on mapping synergies of MSPs addressing multiple SDGs. So this is the presentation that we're giving today. Then we have our guest speaker, Sander. Sander Chan is an assistant professor at the Department of Geography, Planning and Environment at the Radboud University. And he obtained his PhD also from the FU, so welcome back. And lastly, we have Philipp. Philipp Pattberg will introduce himself and the ASI Institute. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Montserrat. Great, everyone, welcome here. And online, hybrid is still not my thing, so I don't know who to address. Yeah, I'm Philipp Pattberg. I'm the director of the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute. We are a platform for all the faculties at the FU to work together. We have 300 colleagues that participate and we work on the SDGs. This is our speaker event. We call it the SDG Academy, and we discuss various of the 17 SDGs. And today is actually SDG 17 on partnerships. And I'm very, very excited. I always say this, that I'm excited, but I'm in particular excited for 3 reasons. The first is it's really nice to do this event live, at least hybrid, because it's nice we have some food and some drinks afterwards and we can discuss. I always like these kind of events. Second, I'm actually part of the team who wrote the report, so I'm sort of advertising myself a little bit, but I'm particularly happy and excited because I'm welcoming an old colleague of mine, Sander Chan. As you heard, he was at the FU and he's now at Radboud University, and it's great to have you back because we go back a long time actually researching partnerships. So I'm really looking forward to hear what you have to say to what we came up with. So very briefly, I know that Karin will say a couple of words of introduction. In September, there's a UN summit, and at that summit, there's a high-level forum, and they look at the SDGs, and it's halfway time. So they will look at the progress, and I already saw a short report that came out a couple of days ago by the Secretary General, and they said, there's no progress. It's really not going well. 30% of the indicators are walking backwards, only 15 are actually where they should be, and a lot of stagnating. So everyone is getting a bit nervous. The title of the preliminary report by the Secretary General, and I have to quote, was Progress Towards the SDGs, Towards a Rescue Plan for People and Planet. Why do we need a rescue plan? Because the SDG process as it is not really working. Now, some people say it's because we don't make enough use of one of the really truly innovative elements of the SDGs, and that's the partnership idea, that they should be implemented in collaboration between governments, civil society, companies, indigenous people, unions, farmers, youth, and everyone basically. And there's one big happy family implementing those SDGs. And I think there's some truth to that. But unfortunately, there's also another story. That is that these partnerships are maybe just a gigantic greenwashing exercise. And so we set out to look at that from an empirical perspective, and we made a new data set. You know, scientists always make data sets, and so we are proud to have one. But in this data set, there are lots of critical, really cool questions, and I'm also looking forward to Oscar, who was the project leader on this work package, to introduce that. So again, welcome, and I hand over to Karin, who will now introduce a bit the background. Really nice to see you all online and here, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion. Karin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I should just find my presentation somewhere, hopefully. I just had it. Yes. See if you can see it. Do you all see it?
Yes, Karin, thank you. It's not on presentation mode yet, but we see it. Great.
Oh, okay. That's always, but can you see it?
We can see it.
But should I stop sharing and try to?
No, it works.
This is totally fine.
Okay.
You can do it like this.
Thank you. Greetings here from Stockholm, and thank you for that kind and excellent introduction, Philip and Montserrat. So I will very quickly, because we need time for the substantial discussion of the report, just mention something about this project, Transformative Partnerships for Sustainable Development. I will not even read out the subtitle, it's very long. It's a 4-year research project where we exactly dive into those themes that Philip looked on assessing the effectiveness and legitimacy of these partners. Do they matter? Are they effective? How can they generate inclusion? And and in this project, we look on, yes, the partnership goals, because there are so much hope with partnerships that the SDG partnerships, the hope is that they are the new generation of partnerships that can really advance and implement the agenda. And the core idea of this project is to look into that. Just if we look on the overall view here, in the UN system, partnerships have been emphasized for long, and we scholars have looked on this since 2002. This figure is actually not showing the partnerships today. They are over 6,000-7,000, depending on how you count, and Oscar and the team will talk about this more. But what you can see is this enormous growth, and often in conjunction with summits. So there is a lot of hope and expectations that partnership should deliver on the SDGs. And with only 7 years to go for the project, we thought this is a very crucial issue to examine. And here, and this is again not completely updated, but you can see how the partnerships are distributed between different goals. And you will see more in the report, where we also make, of course, a distinction between partnership and single individual commitments. But this is just to demonstrate that partnerships are, by the UN system, even if they get also a lot of criticism for not being functional or effective from the scholarly community, they are a very, very popular policy instrument, with the promise of bringing together civil society, business, international organization, and governments in new constellations. Now, they have been along for, partnerships have been, of course, an instrument tool that has been in global politics around for long. Many were launched already at the 2002 World Summit of Sustainable Development. Now we have the so-called new generation of partnerships and the 2030 agenda, but also we can see that they feature very strong in the Secretary General's report on our common future, and will be important instrument in next year's future for the summit. They of course exist at many different levels, and they have this potential for innovation and synergies by bringing together different actors from different sectors and policy areas. But are they really achieving this? And are they also capable of this large-scale sustainability transformation that is emphasized both in the context of Agenda 2030, but also the Paris Agreement? Can they? Do we have too many hopes on them? And I just want to here, again, not taking too much time, but just emphasize the aim of the project, and that is to assess if, how, and under what conditions multi-stakeholder partnerships for sustainable development can contribute to achieve the Agenda 2030 and also accelerate transformation. Where we do look into, are they synergistic? do they avoid trade-off? Are they effective, and are they legitimate in terms of garnering participation, having setting up accountability mechanism for tracking progress? Then, so we want to examine whether they actually contribute to the implementation of the 2030 agenda, and compare the transformative potential of partnerships as a means to achieve this. And then I will not read up all the research questions, but we look on synergies, effectiveness, and legitimacy. And on the legitimacy, we have a work package with Lund colleagues that will examine, are they inclusive in terms of participation, or is it the usual suspects in them? Are they accountable? Are there transparency mechanism? Can we actually see if they deliver progress? And of course, we hope after this, we have 3 or more years to go, that we can come up with recommendations how they can be designed and governed to become more effective and legitimate. I'm seeing now, I don't know how long time I have left, but I will, sorry.
4 minutes, you're good.
Okay, good, for one sake. I skipped this slide, but I want to point to this actually kind of challenge for us as scholarships, because it's more there. We are now in the research community of partnership governance, looking on new frameworks to to assess this complex pathway to effectiveness. And we will examine in the project both what do partnerships produce in terms of output, what is the outcome in terms of behavioral change of the actors involved, and the million-dollar questions. What is their impact? Do they actually contribute to collective problem solving on the problems we face on the ground, whether it's biodiversity loss, runaway climate change, lack of healthcare, poverty. And we also need to research effectiveness are not easy, because we have to see, do they can be individually effective, but do they collectively, when scaled up, contribute to sustainability transformation? And how can partnerships be more synergetic across the goals to hopefully pave the way for sustainability transformation? And we research on this kind of more holistic, systematic, integrative perspectives on partnerships that is still in its infancy, where we need to look very much on the trade-offs and synergies. And I hope, I will end here by saying that I don't only hope, I think the technical report now is a very good start on that important research agenda to take a more systemic, holistic approach to partnerships, because the core of the 2030 agenda is a whole society approach and not overcoming silos. Thank you. I hope I kept the time, and now I'm very curious to see the presentation of the report.
Yes, excellent timekeeping, Karin, and thank you so much for that great overview on the research project. With that, I want to now invite Oscar to take the floor and tell us about this technical report we've been mentioning so much.
Yeah, sure. So hi, everyone. Great to see you. Thanks a lot for joining us today. And hi, everyone online. Great to have you here as well. I will talk a little bit about this report that we have here, which is let's say, the final product of about 1.5 years, I think, of painstakingly full work by a team of at least 4 people here at the FU, or actually a larger team here at the FU, with a lot of contributing authors, 5, 6 more people being part of this group at the FU, at the University of Stockholm, at the Institute for Future Studies, and also expanding into LSE. So it's been a joint effort by people that are professors, but people that are still students, etc. So really a collective work that has, let's say, culminated in what is at least the start of a research project, right? So I want to say that that's really important to think, look, this is really the beginning, we think, of a 4-year research project where we collect much of the empirical evidence that we just want to continue to dig into. And I will reflect in the end of this report on a couple of the questions that we think we can ask this data set. And I'm sure that Sander will come back to that. And I'm very curious, actually. I want to keep my presentation short so I can hear more from you and from you guys in the audience and also online. If there are, what your thoughts are when you see this. So the report really is, let's see here, really is, let's say, the basics, right? So we're starting to like just present data, right, more than to really go into the analysis of why it looks like it looks like. But I think it already, you know, poses a few interesting questions. I will do 3 things. I will start with, maybe we can go to the next slide. The first thing I will do is I will talk about assembling the data set. So how did we actually, you know, go about shaping it? This is a long story. I'm not going to talk too much about methodology. If you have more questions, please let me know. We have more things on it, but I just want to walk you very briefly through on how we got it, because maybe that already answers some of your questions. The second thing I will do, I will show you some of the key findings. So what are the major, let's say, graphs that I can show you in terms of how does the data set look like, and what can we say in terms of potential synergies, because that is the main question. We will get back to that. Finally, I will give you a couple of the key messages and, let's say, future questions that we want to ask this data set. Good, but let's start with how you assemble a data set. Maybe you can go to the next slide. We started with this place called the partnership platform. The partnership platform is, to our knowledge, the most comprehensive place for finding anything that could be a multi-stakeholder partnerships on the SDGs. There are more places, but this is, I think, the most prominent one. This is kept by UN, by the UN and UNDESA, which is a subpart of the UN, which is, let's say, collecting all of these things. And I'm saying things because it's a mishmash of things. It's about 7,000, I think they call it voluntary commitments, multi-stakeholder partnerships, it's governmental plans, it's city plans, whatever, what have you, that touches upon the SDGs. Someone who took the effort to actually send something into the UN and put it on this platform, that's in there. So that's where we had to start. We noticed that we presented this to a couple of people who are running the platform, and we were complaining that it's not only partnerships, and we saw that they just changed the name to actually the SDG Actions platform. So we are already thinking that this is because of our complaining that it's not only partnerships in there, it's actually actions. So we're counting that as societal impact and valorization of this project already, just for so you know. But it's just to say that what we needed to start with was to sift through this thing and figure out, okay, so we want to talk about multi-stakeholder partnership, but what is a multi-stakeholder partnership? So that was our starting point, right? To find, okay, so where can these multi-stakeholder partnerships go? So we did 3 things. We started up with scraping the whole homepage. So we took down everything that's on the homepage, because on each of these entries, with 7,000 things, there is lots of information. So who's in it, where are they at? They have a little text which where they describe themselves, when were they started, when will they end, etc., etc., etc. We took down all of that information. Then we started off with saying, okay, so let's exclude the ones that actually are duplicates, because they turned out that not all of them are, there are a lot of duplicates in that data set, which was a first revelation for us. You go through it, you can go a bit like, hey, wait a minute, this was the same as the one before, you know, which just tells you maybe something about the data set as well. And then we looked at, and this is of course important, we looked at entries that connect SDGs. One of the things that we wanted to look at in the first part is, okay, so which ones have the potential to create synergies? So the SDGs are supposed to take an integrative, holistic approach. Okay, so let's look at the ones that really are trying to connect, you know, poverty and hunger and education, for instance, with climate change and biodiversity and innovation. So we wanted to look at partnerships that only look at more than one SDG, right? The last thing we did was, okay, so we have this data set now of stuff that are at least not duplicates, at least they connect things. And then we want to figure out what's a multi-stakeholder partnership. Now we can have long discussions, and we did as a group on what is a multi-stakeholder partnership. And you know, there isn't one single definition. We have one. I'm not going to show it to you, so we can continue to have the discussion. But we used one which we think is good for this type of project. So this was a bit our methodology. Let's move on. The findings. So first of all, just by assembling the data set, we found a few things which I want to go through. So we start off with this about 7,000 entries. Against, I don't know what to call them really. Actions. Let's call them actions, because that's not a new word, right? So 7,000 actions things, right? We removed duplicates, and just by removing duplicates, we got down to about almost 6,000 or 5,800. So clearly there's 1,200 things in the data set that were just the same things. So that made us a little bit suspicious about, you know, how this data set is collated, or how the platform is collated. But that gave us, you know, at least we were starting to sift down through the system as we wanted. The third thing we did was then addressing, you know, 2 SDGs or more. So which of these things, actions, are addressing more than 2 SDGs? And then we were down to about 2,500. We also wanted them to provide a website, because if you provide a website, that was a bit to figure out, okay, then they're actually something, right? Then the last thing is that we actually went through about 2,500 of these things, read what they're up to, who are they connecting, you know, are they actually, can they be considered a multi-stakeholder partnership? And we ended up with about 560 somewhat-ish multi-stakeholder partnerships. We even brought it down further, that we said there are 2 tiers, some that are more multi-stakeholder partnershipy than others. So that's why you will see this tier 1, tier 2. Tier 1 are the ones that are really multi-stakeholder partnerships, and the other ones are things we suspect to be multi-stakeholder partnerships. So this was really, in the end, an analog, really analog, well, still via computer, but it wasn't automated anymore, right? The first part, we wrote scripts, and we, you know, tried to automate the whole process. In the end, it was just like going down, reading the things. 2,500 things were read. We're down to 600, and that is where we are right now. So this was assembling the data set. Right, next. So what did we find? I want to give you a couple of the main, let's say, the gist of, let's say, the main data. The first thing is that we wanted just to figure out which ones actually are active. So you can put your thing on a web page, but did you actually do something afterwards? Right? We were quite surprised that compared to previous research, it looked quite good. All right, about 78%, or about a little bit more than 50%, are actually active. What do we mean by active? We find proof of life, you know, a pulse, right, online somewhere beyond on the homepage, right, of the UN. So we find them something. That just means so active. Please, you know, they're alive at least, right? And then we found that about a little bit less are concluded. That for us researchers, interesting, because then we can say we can look at the ones that are also concluded and figure out something. However, about 20% show absolutely zero activity beyond being on a homepage, that they made a claim that we're going to do something, but beyond that, you know, pronounced dead, at least according to our database. Gives us a first thing. Second, we looked at the start year and end year, and this really proves, let's say, proves it, at least it's congruent with previous data, is that the purpose and let's say the efforts of mega conferences, some environmental mega conference. Sometimes people ask, why do we send, you know, there was just a water conference at the UN a couple of months ago, and I remember one of my colleagues came back and said, yeah, I don't really know what it's worth. You know, we go there, thousands of people go to talk about water. What is it worth? Well, if you like multi-stakeholder partnerships, you know, it's a good place to start multi-stakeholder partnerships, or rebrand multi-stakeholder partnerships. A lot of stuff are just changing name, right? And we're really seeing these peaks around the Rio +20, the COPs of the UNFCCC, CBD. We see the ocean summits being very active here, for instance, but also other places. We also looked at when they're supposed to end, and we found that 75% of the multi-stakeholder partnerships on the homepage are supposed to have an end date before 2023. So most of them actually should be ended already. So we have, you know, 7,000 things, 6,000 actually are doing something, and we're finding that most of them actually should be ended already. So if you put your trust in multi-stakeholder partnerships, yeah, then we have about 25% of the ones which we found that actually still are active in doing something, at least what they're calling it. So we found that the end date's also interesting because most of them are already done, clearly. Next one. Who's actually involved here? Well, multi-stakeholder partnerships are supposed to connect all parts of society, whole of society approach, like companies working with indigenous peoples, with unions, you said, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Who's setting them up? It's international organizations, it's countries, right? Governments. So we're seeing that international organizations and national governments are by far the most active in setting them up and being part of them. So in one sense, if multi-stakeholder partnerships is about bringing in other actors, the nation state still seems to be very active here, right? Some people arguing that maybe this is just a continuation of current power structures, right? The US, the UK, Germany, super active in setting up multi-stakeholder partnerships. Why is that? We see much less private business, for instance, which is somewhat an interesting finding. Also, non-NGOs, right, much less active. Unions, very little, and local authorities. Now, this is quite also, I think, congruent with previous work. So no surprises, but still, you know, if we're talking about the new generation of partnerships, well, how new is that generation? The next one. What are they doing? Well, they're involved in soft governance, right? So if you trust multi-stakeholder partnerships to change, you do believe that awareness raising, for example, is important. You do believe that, you know, exchanging experiences, capacity building, to some extent, technology transfer, training, participation management, advocacy, right? Those are the mechanisms of change which you need to believe in if you think that this is going to be the change. If this partnership number 17 is going to work, you're not going to go for like hard rules, right? You're going to go for soft mechanisms. Next one. Now we're starting to look at, okay, so what are the SDGs that are the most connected? And here is, I think, a nice little block figure. Maybe you go to the next one. We start to see what are the SDGs that are actually most connected, because some SDGs needs to be more connected maybe than others, because some are maybe have more potential to be connected. So what we're seeing in general is that the environmental goals are very well connected, right? The nature, life on the water, for instance, climate change. There we see that the more partnerships are very good at trying to connect them. To some extent, I think this is health and education, also part of it. But maybe next slide also show it a little bit better. We see clusters emerging here around life on land, life below water, and climate. So there's like an environment cluster. There's also health, education, and gender equality, also a bit of a cluster. Climate and energy, of course, connected. Very, very well and very, very good. Of course, you need biodiversity. You can't stop biodiversity loss before you stop climate change, etc., etc., etc. But what about, if you want to change consumption behaviors? What if you want more innovation? What if you need to, we want degrowth? Yeah, if you like those things, well, consumption, production. Where do we have innovation, for instance? Inequality here, right? Very not as much connected to the rest, right? So again, you have to kind of believe that this silo approach to some extent will work with soft governance methods. Finally, or maybe you have one more slide, I think we'd also show this. This shows a little bit more the centrality of the climate goal, right? Compared to the rest. But again, consumption, production, innovation to some extent, peace and justice, not that important, apparently, if you look at how multi-stakeholder partnerships want to work. So again, what do you trust here? Well, some things are more important than other things. So finally, what are the key messages that we have? Well, first of all, we do think that the MSPs have the potential to connect the environmental goals in particular. To some extent, the social economic goals, but really the environmental goals are the most important ones if you look at that. Second, we do see that the clean water in particular, changing consumption and production patterns are not really addressed through the multi-stakeholder partnerships. Hence, if you want a different type of growth, well, the partnerships are maybe not their place to be. Are they then transformative or not? Yeah, already we're starting to question that. We see that there's quite some activity, but also about 20% are not there at all. The large UN summits do feel a very important part of being like a launch pad, an arena for these things to start up. We see that public authorities in general are the most important players in this, which is interesting because it's really like the public authorities are already working through the UN, and then they also are doing things in the multi-stakeholder partnerships. So the whole of society approach is somewhat limited. And finally, we find that nearly half of the MSPs have knowledge dissemination as a main mechanism of change. So then, awareness raising needs to be important. Finally, what are some of the papers that we have in the pipeline that where we want to work on this? One of the things we want to look at is, okay, so we have these partnerships. What type of transformation do they talk about? If at all, they do talk about transformation. So what, for example, do they believe in tech? Is technology change the big thing? Are we going to just put a price on things? Or do we believe in, let's say, bottom-up, polycentric emerging action from the ground, civil society? What type of transformations do they talk to if they talk about it? Another one is we talk about, okay, so what do they actually connect the nexuses that we need to connect, right? So what are the SDGs that should be connected, and are they connected then? So these are papers that we are currently working on. And finally, I also want to bring up, how do actually partnership connect SDGs? So yeah, they promise to connect SDGs, but exactly how do they do that? Because we know as researchers that it's really hard to connect, different disciplines and different topics. How does a partnership try to do it then, if we want to look like that? Good. Finally, we have a QR code. The tech report have two different versions. You have the nice little PDF, which you can download. You can also download a little bit or look at a little bit more funky place, which has some kind of interactive graphs, which you can play with. You can find it on our GitHub page, or just scan this QR code. Great. I think I'll stop there. I should have stopped probably a couple of minutes ago. Okay. I saw you going quiet. So I will now hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Oscar, for that very interesting presentation of our main findings that we saw when putting together the data. For those who didn't manage to scan the QR code, we also have it here and somewhere over there, so you'll find it for sure. With that, I want to welcome Sander to the podium to maybe challenge us, maybe discuss your thoughts on the report.
Thank you very much, and I would like to congratulate you with this great data set, and I think it's absolutely important to have this data set and to really track what essentially are all promises. So I wanted to kind of structure my intervention around some promises of multi-stakeholder partnerships, and I do have some slides here, but I see a lot of parallelism with research that was done in the past, but also current research, especially on multi-stakeholder partnerships in climate action. Next slide, please. So I won't go again through your conclusions, but I think you see a lot of potential for synergies. At the same time, I kind of disagree a little bit that this set seems to be more effective, because I think there's a bias in the selection of initiatives that, for instance, don't have a website. So I think actually, in line with previous research, multi-stakeholder partnerships might not be so effective, really, if we look at the broader, larger landscape of multi-stakeholder partnerships, but there might be something to look into. You also show that summits are very important launch pads for partnerships, but is that enough? Like, should we have so many summits, and should they be mainly launching partnerships? And we also see that there's a relation between government, international organizations, or traditional actors and partnerships. Next slide, please. So generally, I think these findings, they kind of align a little bit with the promises of multi-stakeholder partnerships. And there are multiple promises, but let me just highlight three of them. One is that these partnerships bring together transnational actors that effectively contribute to sustainability governance, and perhaps more effective than governments do. The other promise is that they engage broadly, so many types of actors, and deliver broad benefits, as we also show from your data set. The third thing is that somehow, with all these partnerships, like 6,000 of them, or actions, that they somehow all work together and they are coordinated in a way that kind of furthers the transitions that we want to see. Next slide, please. And this is very familiar. Like I'm doing research myself on what you could call multi-stakeholder partnerships for climate action. And in our research, for instance, we find that only 17 large-scale, effectively implemented mitigation partnerships could bring us on path to limiting global warming to 2 degrees by 2030. This is huge news, right? When we know that governments, you know, if we rely on governments, we're on course to 3.7 or 4 degrees Celsius. So this is huge news. It means that the potential of partnerships seems to be much bigger than governments. Next slide, please. However, I think we need to look beyond the promise, and I'm sure you will. And one thing that we are doing, and I won't go into the technicalities of it, but we kind of look at every partnership, whether they produce the output that we expect them to produce if they want to fulfill their functions. And what we see very consistently over the years, over the last 10 years, is that about half or less than half would even meet the minimal production to have any positive impact in terms of environmental impacts, changes in environmental indicators, but also behavioral impacts. So that's quite worrying. And I would say that there's also kind of differences between different sectors, but overall, it doesn't look good. Next slide, please. One thing that is also a constant is the type of activities and functions that these partnerships fulfill. And I think it's no coincidence that we kind of look at basically the same functions. But how to interpret it? Like Oscar, you said, like a lot of these are kind of the more soft functions. What we project here is, on the one hand, like what they address, like which functions do they address, and what are they more, where do they score more effectively at? So there you see that, you know, this focus on knowledge dissemination and maybe also knowledge production is logical if you look at what they are good at. These initiatives seem to be, these partnerships seem to be good at knowledge dissemination, and maybe they should even do more of it. They are good at what is it? Sorry, they're good at so including more actors. Maybe that is what they should focus on. They're very bad at on-the-ground action. They're very bad at implementing things on the ground, which might be a reason for worry, but maybe we should not leave that up to multi-stakeholder partnerships. Next slide, please. So with this promise on effectiveness, I would like to ask, why would partnerships be transformational when they have historically struggled to even achieve minimal effectiveness? What is different now? And I hope that there is something different now, and maybe for some sectors that is true, but I think this is a challenge I would like to put out there, not only for you, but also for myself. Next slide, please. The second promise is of broad engagement and broad benefits. And indeed, you showed that climate action links to all these SDGs. That is also what we find. Potentially a lot of synergies. And I would say these are synergies mostly because we look at what these partnerships refer to as contributing to. So these are synergies. Next slide, please. But the reality is that rather than, for instance, alleviating inequalities around the world or standing for peace and justice, what we have seen quite worryingly over the last almost 10 years is the share of implementation and outputs in highly developed and rich countries is increasing, and actually quite fast, quite consistently, at least among climate partnerships. So whatever they do and whatever good they do, like a lot of it doesn't happen, the benefits don't accrue where they are most needed. Next slide, please. So this brings me to the question regarding to the promise of broad engagement and broad benefits. What prevents partnerships from aggravating structural inequalities? Because time and again, we see that they actually aggravate it. To what extent and how do partnerships acknowledge and manage interactions? And I would say it's important to look at trade-offs here as well. And I think by looking at what these multi-stakeholder partnerships mention, they tend to, there might be a bias towards showing off what they are good at, but not what harm they might do. This is something we are currently working on with partnerships in the agriculture, forest, land use sector. But one thing I think that is important that we might need to switch the unit of analysis from multi-stakeholder partnership to and disaggregate them in the activities that they do, because because the trade-offs are not necessarily tied up with this broader partnership category, but with the precise activities that they do. Next slide, please. And then the final promise is that somehow fragmentation is overcome and all actions are coordinated. And some of you might be quite familiar with this orchestration theory that we can somehow coordinate all actors, or mostly international organizations, in a way that everyone contributes to the same sustainable development goals. Next slide, please. And one thing that also became clear from your investigation is the importance of international organizations and the summits they are organizing. One thing that we also notice is that summits are definitely a boon for multi-stakeholder partnership. However, what we also notice is that the sets of partnerships that summits have launched over the years have become, on average, less effective over time. So this is from a recent publication in Nature Climate Change, where we show how often the more recent climate summits have also been the worst climate summits. If you just look at the at what these initiatives produce, and we did correct for novelty and such. Of course, younger initiatives still have more time, need more time to develop. So there might be a mechanism that makes partnerships as an instrument less transformative over time. And that is that initially, if you have a certain sustainability environmental challenge, it's initially easy to pick the low fruit and organize around it. But when it really comes down to take the last steps toward net zero or nature positive, that is the hard part, where multi-stakeholder partnerships don't just appear. And if they appear, they might not effectively challenge. Next slide. I'm almost there. Yeah. Regarding this last promise, then, we need to ask, how can international organizations, governments, and other orchestrators become more than launch pads for partnerships? Next slide. So very briefly, some concluding thoughts. One thing that I notice is that UN platforms, they don't make a distinction anymore between partnerships and actions, and there might be good reasons for that. But one thing is that there's uneven attention in the development of norms and accountability norms between individual and multi-stakeholder partnerships, where we see, for instance, if I look at climate around net zero commitments, there's ISO guidelines, there's a high-level expert group convening to define criteria for legitimate individual action. None of that for partnerships. The other thing is research and tracking of partnerships is absolutely critical, and that's why your work is so important. But it's not only important for understanding their potential, but definitely also their limits and the trade-offs they produce. Partnerships by themselves can never be transformative on their own, because transformation can only result, I think, in interaction with the larger governance system, with other governance mechanisms, including regulatory mechanisms. And finally, we need to also do research in the contextual conditions that unlock the transformative power of partnerships insofar it is there. And that kind of brings me back to the first slide, really, like, why do we expect that partnerships will be transformative now? What structural conditions, what contextual conditions have changed? Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sander. I guess a lot of us in this room can identify that feedback from an outsider is the scariest and the most valuable. So I really, really appreciate that. And I'm looking forward to discuss this more later. I think seeing that we have around 10 minutes left or so, we should move on to some Q&A. So I already have some questions from the online participants that are actively asking for the link to the report. So I will start with a question there, and then you can have your curiosity bubble a bit more, and then I'll turn to the audience here. So yeah, we have an immediate reaction maybe to what you explained in terms of that you see that few partnerships are good at implementation, or that there exists few partnerships and doing that. And then an immediate reaction from Laurent here in the chat is that perhaps partnerships that work on the ground do not actually spend time registering on these platforms. So maybe my question is then, do you think this is true? And also, how do we deal with that as researchers trying to map this field? So maybe, I don't know if you want to answer, or we all have thoughts on this, but maybe Sander, any immediate
yeah, so I think it's not necessary for every partnership and project to be online or something, right? So especially when they're very local. But one thing that we consistently see is the underrepresentation of partnerships based in the global south. It might be a bit different with SDG partnerships, but I think that is a research challenge to kind of maybe not only take from those platforms, but actively try to locate partnerships in the global south.
Yeah, I think something that, and I know you guys have been doing a lot of work on that, and you really start to see immediately when you go into global south. Of course, there's lots of multi-stakeholder partnerships. I think there's something that we struggle with a lot as well, right? So when, of course, what is the population of partnerships globally? Well, first of all, we spent a year discussing what is a partnership, what is a multi-stakeholder partnership. What we have focused on, at least in the report, is what we call transnational partnerships. So they should work across at least a couple of countries. And there we would, I think with good value, expect them to have at least a homepage, or at least be somewhere online. If you Google them, do they exist? Right? Maybe they don't. Maybe they don't spend time on that. But a funder wants to show off what they're doing, right? We as a university, we want to show off what we're doing. And how do we do it? Well, we put up things on LinkedIn or on Twitter or online somewhere. If you don't exist online at all, sure, it's possible. You don't spend that much time, at least a little bit of time, because we just look for a pulse. We don't need much to call you active. So I do see the concern, but I want to see it really, because we heard this before, but I want to see it being proven. I'm not sure if the proof of pudding is in our side, but we're very well aware that the population here is very difficult to kind of figure out.
Right. Yeah, thank you. I think Philip also had a...
Yeah, just to illustrate this, I think there is always a big disclaimer in this type of research, and that is we look at the stuff that's easy to look at because we're also a bit short on time, and so you could dig deep. And just to illustrate that, I had a colleague who did a study on partnerships in the biodiversity realm, just looking at Spanish as a language of their main reporting, and we found tons of partnerships. Sure. In South America and Middle America that we never thought that exist, only because we switched the language of search from English to Spanish. So no one is saying that this is the total amount, but for some practical reasons, I would agree with Oscar, we have to make it practical, but we should always have this disclaimer. So I think the question from the chat is really good.
Yeah.
We should never assume that there are X amount of, we don't know. We just do not know that. And so, yeah, and what that means we can discuss in a second, if that's a good thing or bad thing.
I'm going to invite the speakers to come in front to give answers because Martha just made me aware the online people can't see.
Oh,
so
makes sense.
Sure. Sorry.
So we stand in the line.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yes,
Yeah.
I think this works great.
Sure.
No, thank you for your reactions to that question. I also think this question comes from someone that is closely related to the implementation partnership. So I'm looking forward to hear more about that at a different time.
Absolutely.
The second question is now they're coming in. This is sparking reactions, but maybe we take a question from the room first before the online ones. Or if there was, I saw a hand in the back from. Was there?
My question was a bit similar to what was already discussed.
Okay.
To what extent is it, or did you look at geographical distribution of these partnerships as well? Where are these partnerships mostly located?
Yeah.
Right. So just to repeat the question, yeah.
Yeah. So the question is from the room is basically, do we look at it? What in terms of geographical location? Where are they? Very interesting question, which seems like a simple thing to look at. But then you get into a little like, what do you do with something that's a multi-stakeholder partnership? Countries, organizations that are in many countries. So WWF, for example, has their headquarters in one country, but are located all across the world. So, where do we place WWF, for instance? Countries are easy, cities are easy, but a company, Coca-Cola is on 8 stock exchanges in the world. Where is Coca-Cola? So to some extent, it's easy to figure out where they are. But what we are trying to look at is both target country, but where they are based as at headquarters, if they have a headquarter. A lot of the multi-stakeholder partnerships are, let's say, networked organizations with hosting in partnership, hosting secretariats, for instance, at UNEP somewhere like that. But also we were trying to look at where they're based more, where they're trying to perform action. I think your research there is interesting to say, look, they're doing more and more in richer countries.
Yeah.
Which is, is that a function of new partnerships doing that? New partnerships coming and they're doing more in rich countries, so we see a decrease in other countries, or is it because
it's over the total set, right? Like from the last 10 years. So probably also partnerships that were active 10 years ago. Like if we just look at the total output, then the share of high income countries is increasing.
Yeah.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question on that one? But your data was only looking at climate partnerships, was that the case?
Yep.
And then you're saying the benefits of increasing in high-income countries. But in terms of climate partnerships, is it better that they're in high-income countries, as in they're disproportionately emitting?
That's true. Like it's not a very straightforward kind of evaluation thing, because you could argue that actors in the global north have a bigger responsibility and therefore should do more. But for instance, if you split it out between adaptation and mitigation, you would see the same. And with adaptation, I would say the vulnerabilities, the exposure is definitely higher in the global south.
Thank you. I think we have time maybe for 1 or 2 more questions. So one question from Maria, probably in a different building, so very close to us, is because our project or the report specifically now looks at synergies, right? So in the triangles, in the network figure, we talk about synergies, and her question is, what can we say about trade-offs in terms of mapping these MSPs? So do we assume that they then also equally well address trade-offs across those how far have you gotten there?
How far? Maybe I'll look at you.
Yeah.
We are so we're building, let's say, the data that we have shown. I think it's a great question, and it's something that we get constantly with when we say synergy. We hear like we should definitely look at trade-offs as well. We will, and we are. We even talked about looking at neutral situations, but we don't know what happens, because if nothing happens, then how do you look at that? But the question is, let's say, how do you deal with things that maybe are trade-offs? Maybe not everything is a win-win situation, and definitely something that's on our radar. What we're trying to look at now is, okay, so what we have in our data set is partnerships that are trying to address 2 or more SDGs at the same time, right? So they have this explicit wish to address more than 2, right? Now, the next step, of course, of the data is to figure out how does that play out in practice, right? And that takes much more granular, fine-grained, let's say, research, much more qualitative research, I think, to figure out, okay, so how does it actually play out in practice, and on what level, right? To what extent do, for example, you have communities talking about climate change and biodiversity and health. To what extent do we see synergies between them? That could be that you start to learn to talk the same language. As a researcher, you see the huge differences in how people from the land use world talk to people from the climate world, talk to people from poverty and economies, talking to them, etc. So that's one thing. We always want to look at how it plays out on the ground. Can we measure the CO2 emissions, or can we measure this or that? But our research stops much earlier, I think, trying to figure out, okay, so people want to start to work together on certain issues. How does that play out? What we're looking at right now is just the ones that want to work together on something. And the next step will be, okay, so does that actually play out? I think trade-off will be a key thing to figure out.
Yeah, sure. Any more reactions? Otherwise, I have maybe a final question, which is linking to you speaking about measuring things. Maya from online asks, can we really talk about the SDGs and maybe then also effective MSPs if there isn't a unified global framework to measure how well they do things? So how do we, maybe that's our job as researchers to come up with those measures, right? But do you see a challenge? What challenges do you see in that?
I think so maybe I'm sure Sandra has a lot to say on this. So for me, it's a bit. I don't think we should, with partnerships, with many other things. I work more and more in biodiversity. There isn't one measure for success rate. Climate change has this really nice benefit of saying, well, how many CO2 emissions do we have from something? ppm in the atmosphere, right? There is one number, but with most things in life, it's much more difficult to kind of measure. And I think there is, I think it would be really amiss to say that we should have one way of measuring success, because there are many different perspectives. And we are going to choose a couple of different ways. We're addressing that right now in the second working package. What do we think is effectiveness? And then we're going to get to things of legitimacy, justice, equity, for instance, which are equally important, I think, to figure out what you say. Do they actually transform, current power structures? Well, that's different than effectiveness. Mm-hmm. So what I think is maybe more interesting is to look at plurality of measurements, and then to try to figure out if you can create a holistic picture around that. Instead of, let's say, trying to figure out the way of measuring how partnerships should look like. But that would be my idea.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think there's a reason why projects like ours often combine the questions of legitimacy and effectiveness, because these questions are very much tied up. And how you define effectiveness is not, it's not one answer. Having said that, I do think that there's a set of tools and a number of understandings of effectiveness that always come back. And so how I try to understand the effectiveness of multi-stakeholder partnerships is, ranges from the initial output and the targets they set to the environmental impacts and the behavioral changes you can see that can be attributed to that, to those partnerships. But one thing that we are very bad at is kind of progressing from the input side of things to the impact things of things. And I do think that in climate, it's a little bit further, for sure, in that sense. Yeah.
And if I might add a tiny thing, I think this is also a little bit dependent on our silos in academia. you know, what we are trying to figure out much more within the IBM, and Institute for Environmental Studies, where some of us are based at least, is how can we work with other people, you know, geographers, how can we work with our climate, you know, our hydrologists, etc., to try to tie, you know, the things we're doing on partnerships with other types of disciplines, with maybe, you know, actually people going out and measuring things in terms of the natural world, etc. So to figure out kind of like how to tie those two disciplines, I think that's really something we need to figure out. And for me, really is an exciting, you know, next step, which maybe we don't do in this project, but at least for the next, you know, 10 years, to connect, as you say, what we do with, let's say, the impact part.
Right. Thank you. And with that, and the fact that it's 5 p.m. already, or 1 minute past, I think I will have to stop us here and thank, first of all, Montserrat for moderating most of this, also for thank Karin for joining online, and Oscar and Sander for being in the spotlight here. So I think Karin maybe, she's clapping hands. Okay, nice. Nice. And so thank you everyone for joining online. We will be sending a follow-up email with the PDF and the link to the report, so you can, and the slides as well if you want to look closer into the statistics. So I say bye to you, and also for the people in the room, we now have an opportunity to discuss with each other over some drinks and some borrow. So thank you so much for coming.